On August 13th, 1946, a guilty verdict was announced in a Wise County, Virginia courtroom that made news across the country and became a part of the history of Appalachia. Today we tell that story. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, a History of Appalachia. Now, be sure to go down below and click that subscribe button, and be sure you ding that bell so you get notification of every single story we put out. And if you don't mind, give us one of these too, okay?
And be nice. We want you to come back and listen to more of our and watch more of our podcast. But Steve, you've already got my attention once again. A 1946 guilty verdict announced in Wise County, Virginia in a courtroom. First thing I think of is it had to be a murder or something, but it was something a little bit different, wasn't it?
Well, this is actually probably the second most well-known trial that happened in Wise County after Edith Maxwell.
Wow.
And it involved an animal. Have I
think I know
whetted
where
your
we're
interest
going.
enough?
Yeah, I think I know where we're going with this one, Steve. Okay.
All righty. To many people from outside the region, the mention of the word Appalachia brings to mind many stereotypes. Probably the one most common is that of snake handling churches. Now, there are churches that do believe in handling deadly serpents, justifying it by some passages in the Bible, and I'm not going to, get into those passages. I think most people have heard those. However, the practice of snake handling is illegal in all the states in Appalachia except one. Do you know which one that is, Rod?
Yes, I do. It's got to be wild, wonderful West Virginia.
It is, and it's legal there because folks there are deemed to have a constitutional right to practice their religion, even if that means putting them at risk of being bitten by a poisonous serpent. Those laws, though, haven't stopped the practice outside of West Virginia.
Mm-hmm. Well, in far southwestern Virginia, there have been congregations that practice snake handling, and there have been trials based on folks getting hurt doing so. Well, today we're going to travel back to 1946 and one of the most well known cases of one of those snake handling cases. Harvey O. Kirk was the pastor of the Christian Church of God in Ramsey, a tiny community near Norton, Virginia. He and his wife, a 26-year-old, Anna, were the parents of several children, and in the summer of 1946, the couple were expecting another baby. Well, on September 1st, 1946, Reverend Kirk was holding a service in Ramsey. There for that service were three other fundamental pastors from Wise and Lee counties: Leander Ely, John Wilson, and Paul Dotson. Now, as the service got to rolling, somebody, well, nobody knows exactly who, handed Reverend Kirk a copperhead, a snake, okay? Reported as either, well, a rattlesnake or a copperhead, one or the other. But it was in various newspaper accounts that either way, it was a snake. Anna Kirk was standing next to her husband when he got a hold of that snake. She reached over with her hand and went to pat the reptile on the head. Said snake apparently just didn't like that move. Okay? And when Mrs. Kirk's hand got close enough, it struck and it bit her several times. Anna immediately pulled her hand back. The pastor dropped the snake, and all attention was now focused on the pastor's wife.
Well, at first she was okay, but things began to go downhill over the next 2 days. As her condition worsened, Anna was offered medical attention, but she refused it, relying on her faith to see her through. As time passed, though, there were complications with her unborn child. She eventually gave birth to a stillborn baby, and hours later, while softly singing gospel hymns, Anna Kirk passed away. Reverend Kirk was arrested and charged in the death of his wife. Also arrested were Mr. Ely, Mr. Wilson, and Mr. Dotson, charged with giving that snake to Reverend Kirk. Now, at trial, Kirk testified that after being bitten by the snake, he asked his wife if she wanted to be taken to the hospital or if he could get a doctor to come help her. According to Harvey Kirk, his wife refused, saying that she had promised the Lord that if she were ever bitten, she'd trust in him. The next day, though, he said he did walk to Dr. G.T. Faust's office to get him to come help his wife and unborn child, which he did. helping in the delivery. According to Kirk, Dr. Faust couldn't say whether the snake bite had anything to do with the miscarriage, although the doctor himself testified that the bite was the cause of Anna's death. Reverend Kirk maintained that he didn't know he was being handed a poisonous snake until it was in his hands and only became aware of it when he felt his wife reach over to touch it.
Well, the jury in Wise County found Harvey Kirk guilty of involuntary manslaughter of his wife and recommended that his punishment be 2 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary. At that, Kirk's attorney, Vernoy B. Tate, made a motion that the verdict be set aside. Judge George Morton ordered Tate to make his motion in writing and set the hearing on it for August 19th. Attorney Tate's motion was denied, and he filed an appeal before the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals. His appeal rested on several grounds, including the fact that several jurors were seated on the trial even though they had expressed sentiments against Kirk before the trial even began. Key, though, was that his argument was that Kirk had nothing to do with bringing the poisonous snakes to the surface that day. It was the last argument that apparently swayed the Virginia Supreme Court, for they then set aside the trial court's verdict and sent the case back down to be tried again.
Well, this time around, Reverend Harvey O. Kirk decided that it would be better to work out a plea agreement with the Commonwealth's attorney. And this he did. And on August 28th, 1948, he pleaded guilty to a charge of manslaughter in return for a 3-month jail sentence. One other condition: Mr. Kirk wanted some time to get his affairs in order, including finding someone to take care of his children before he reported to the Wise County Jail to begin serving that 3-month sentence. Judge Morton allowed him to do so, resetting the case for sentencing 4 days later on September 1st, which ironically would have been the second anniversary of that fatal snake bite. Now, Rod, those 4 days were all the good Reverend needed to make his getaway.
You're kidding, Steve. A
No.
getaway by the good Reverend? Well, on September 1st, 1948, Harvey O. Kirk failed to show for his sentencing hearing and a 3-month manhunt began. No trace of Kirk was found in the mountains of southwest Virginia, so the search widened. By November, he was located in a tourist camp near Winter Haven, Florida. While this might seem an odd place for him to go, it actually wasn't. You see, this part of Florida had also had a place where snake handling, as well as fundamentalist churches, are located, and authorities figured, well, that was just as good a place as any to start to look for the wanted pastor. Polk County Deputy Hagan Parrish announced that Harvey Kirk had been picked up and brought into the Polk County Jail, where he would await transportation back to Virginia by Wise County Deputy Carl Fleming. Kirk returned to Virginia to serve his sentence. Afterward, he and his children returned to Florida, where he continued as a pastor. He lived on Kirk Road in Eagle Lake and passed away at Bartow Memorial Hospital there in 1983 at the age of 91, leaving 4 sons, 3 daughters, and several stepchildren. Now, Bartow, Florida, that sounds familiar to me. I think for some reason, I think there was a NASCAR driver, I think originally from that area, Rick Wilson. That's the reason why I know about Bartow,
Hmm.
Florida. I mean, it's just a little bit there, I guess, a little west, maybe of the center of the state. But Bartow, Florida, popular place, at least for Harvey Kirk.
Well, it's a popular place for a lot of these snake handling churches too. So
Hmm.
apparently that was just the place to go, and they kind of knew where he was at. Now, here's a little side note on Mrs. Anna Kirk
Okay.
and the news media. We've talked about this before, how the news media tends to try to stereotype Appalachians.
Right.
This was a huge story all over the country because, obviously it's those silly hillbillies and their crazy snake handling practices, which must be widespread down there. Everybody must be doing that. In the papers, every time they talked about Anna Kirk, the poor woman getting bit by the snake, they just happened to mention a little fact about her medical history.
Oh.
You see, she had been a patient 3 times at the Southwestern Mental Institute, the place up in Marion, Virginia.
That's another little reputation sort of thing, and
Hmm.
at least in Appalachia and Southwest Virginia about sending somebody to Marion. But still, go ahead,
Yeah,
Steve.
yeah. Well, I have no idea what she was there for. I mean, that
Hmm.
has nothing to do with it. I mean, she could have been depressed. She could have been suffering from, any number of things. But, I just found that to be something that didn't need to be put in those papers other than to show, yeah,
Right.
you pat a snake, you must be crazy.
Smear campaign out of the whole thing. Well, here's another funny thing. We were talking about at the beginning of the podcast, West Virginia is known
Hmm.
for allowing snake handling. And,
Right.
there are people that say, yes, it goes on outside of West Virginia and other states. I'll never forget here several years ago, I was watching something, I believe, on Discovery Channel or Animal Planet about someone in southeastern Kentucky who was going out and catching snakes,
Oh,
and
yeah.
he had
Yeah.
a entire room uh, above a garage filled with just about any kind of snake you could be looking for. Copperhead, one of those rattlers, the big, I guess, what are they, timberline rattlers or something like that,
Hmm.
but they grow to be very huge. And he was raising all of these. He would go and he'd send his children up to feed them, drop a mouse down, the same thing that most people do about pythons today and pets. And then they finally caught him. And they kind of gave him a little smack on the hand over it and told him, you can't do this sort of thing. But the man said, and he made a comment, he says, it's the only thing I've ever known. And that
Yeah.
was what was wild to me, and he was one of these people that was a very religious person. He believed in this whole thing. He didn't handle them per se out in church, but he got them for people and he sent them to West Virginia. That it was until they caught him.
Yeah. Well, folks, that's the story of a tragic death in a snake handling church in Southwest Virginia. Another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, if you'd like to subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast, lots of places to go do that, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Audible, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, or wherever you find podcasts. Till next we meet. So long, everybody.
So long.